Voices in the walls. The house stood at the end of a quiet street, its towering presence casting long, uneasy shadows in the fading evening light. It wasn't particularly old, nor did it have the appearance of a place burdened by dark history. But from the moment the Campbell family stepped inside, something felt wrong. Sarah Campbell, her husband Mark, and their two children, Emily and Jacob, had moved into the house in search of a fresh start. The previous owners had sold it at a suspiciously low price, eager to leave. Sarah chalked it up to financial troubles, until the first night. Lying in bed, Sarah stirred at the sound of a faint rustling, like the dry scratch of fingernails against wood. She turned toward Mark, who was already snoring deeply beside her. Maybe it was just the house settling. Maybe it was nothing. She closed her eyes. Then she heard it. A whisper. At first, it was so soft she almost mistook it for the wind slipping through the cracks of the old walls. But as she strained to listen, her heart clenched. It wasn't the wind. It was words. Sarah. Her breath hitched. The whisper was delicate, almost affectionate, but it sent an unnatural chill through her body. She bolted upright, glancing around the darkened room. The air was still, thick with silence. Maybe she had imagined it. Shaking it off, she lay back down. But just as her eyes began to flutter shut, the whisper returned. Sarah, wake up. She gasped and flipped on the bedside lamp, casting an amber glow against the walls. Mark stirred beside her. Sarah, he murmured groggily. What's wrong? She swallowed hard, her pulse racing. I thought I heard something. Mark blinked at her, then grumbled, it's an old house. Probably just creaking. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, Sarah felt it, something unseen had whispered her name. The next day. The morning sun spilled through the windows, but the unease from the previous night clung to Sarah like a shadow. As she prepared breakfast, Emily, their 10-year-old daughter, shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Mom, she mumbled, who were you talking to last night? Sarah's hands stilled over the cutting board. What do you mean? Emily yawned. I woke up and heard you whispering. But when I looked into your room, you were asleep. Sarah's fingers curled around the knife's handle. A chill ran through her bones. What did the whisper sound like? Emily shrugged. It sounded like you. But weird. Like. I dunno. Like something was pretending to be you. A cold shiver crawled up Sarah's spine. Before she could respond, Jacob, their 7-year-old son, ran into the kitchen, his face pale. Mom! Someone's talking in my room. Sarah and Mark exchanged a glance. What do you mean, buddy? Mark asked, kneeling beside him. Jacob's lower lip trembled. I heard whispers in the walls. Mark sighed, rubbing his face. It's probably just pipes shifting in the walls. Houses make noise. No. Jacob stomped his foot. It said my name. Silence filled the kitchen. Sarah clenched her fists. It wasn't just her. The kids had heard it, too. That night. The family tried to brush off the whispers as their imagination. But as darkness settled over the house, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. She lay in bed, holding her breath, listening. Hours passed. Then. A faint sound, just beneath the surface of silence. Scratch. Scratch. Her body tensed. The noise was coming from inside the walls. Then the whisper slithered through the darkness. I see you, Sarah. She froze. The voice was inside the walls. She wanted to wake Mark, to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. Her breath came in short gasps as the whisper grew closer. I know you can hear me. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The voice was impossibly near, as if pressing against the drywall. Then, something knocked inside the wall. Sarah yelped, scrambling upright, her heart nearly exploding. The knocking came again, louder. It was right behind the headboard. Then, it stopped. The silence was worse than the sound. For the rest of the night, Sarah didn't sleep. She wasn't alone. Something was inside the walls. And it was waiting. The next morning, Sarah was running on barely an hour of sleep. The whispers hadn't returned, but she had stayed awake, listening, waiting, dreading the moment they would. Mark kissed her forehead as he grabbed his keys. "You look exhausted." "I barely slept." "You've been stressing about the move," he said. "I'll check the walls later. Maybe there's a draft or something." Sarah nodded, but deep down, she knew it wasn't a draft. Something was in their house. Emily's room. Sarah was halfway through making coffee when Emily called from upstairs. "Mom! Come here." Heart pounding, Sarah hurried to her daughter's room. Emily stood by the wall, pointing at it with wide eyes. "It's in there," she whispered. Sarah's mouth went dry. "What's in there?" Emily pressed her ear to the wallpaper. "The voices." Sarah hesitated, then did the same. At first, there was nothing. But then, a faint, breathy whisper slithered through the wall. "Emily." Sarah jerked back. Her daughter stared at her, tears welling in her eyes. "You heard it, didn't you?" Sarah swallowed hard. "Go downstairs, sweetie." Emily didn't argue. As soon as she left, Sarah ran her fingers along the wall. It felt solid. Normal. But behind it, something was there. Something that knew her daughter's name. The discovery. Determined to find answers, Sarah spent the next few hours searching for anything unusual about the house. She combed through the basement, the attic, even the blueprints. Then, she found it. An old floor plan stuffed in a drawer. The house had hidden crawl spaces behind the walls. Her stomach turned. Was someone, or something, inside them? Jacob's terror. That night, Sarah kept the discovery to herself, but the whispers continued. At 2 a.m., Jacob's scream shattered the silence. Sarah and Mark bolted from bed, rushing to his room. Jacob was curled in a corner, sobbing. "What happened?" Sarah knelt beside him. He pointed a shaking finger at the wall. "The man in the wall," he whimpered. Sarah's stomach lurched. "What did you see?" Mark asked. Jacob hiccuped through his sobs. He smiled at me." Mark frowned. "Buddy, no one's there." Jacob wailed. "He was in the wall. He smiled at me through the cracks." Sarah's blood turned to ice. There were no cracks. Then, a knock came from inside the wall. Slow. Rhythmic. 1, 2, 3. Mark went rigid. Jacob buried his face in Sarah's chest. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then the whisper came. "I see you all." Sarah clutched her son tighter. Something was in the walls. And it was watching them. The next morning, Sarah stood in front of the basement door, gripping a flashlight. Mark had left for work, and the kids were at school. She was alone. But she had to know. The whispering. The knocking. The hidden spaces behind the walls. It all pointed to one thing: something was inside this house with them. With a deep breath, she descended into the basement. The hollow behind the walls. The air grew colder as Sarah stepped onto the cement floor. A musty smell filled the space, and dust swirled in the beam of her flashlight. She moved along the walls, tapping lightly. Thud. Thud. Hollow. Her pulse quickened. She traced her fingers along the wooden paneling and felt an indentation. A seam. A door. Her breath hitched. She hadn't noticed this before. With trembling hands, she pressed against it. It gave way. A crawlspace of nightmares. A narrow, dark passage stretched before her, the air inside damp and stale. The walls were lined with decaying wood, and the space was barely wide enough to squeeze through. Her flashlight flickered. Then, a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." Sarah gasped and swung her flashlight. Nothing. But the whisper had been right beside her ear. She wanted to run, but something caught her eye, deep scratches along the wooden beams. Claw marks. Human nails embedded in the splintered wood. Her stomach churned. Someone had been trapped in here. Or worse, something still was. The face in the dark. A low creak sounded behind her. Sarah spun around. A shape moved in the darkness, just beyond her flashlight's reach. Then, a face. Gaunt. Hollow eyes. A stretched, twisted grin. It was watching her. Sarah screamed and scrambled backward, hitting her head against the wooden frame. Her flashlight tumbled from her hands, rolling across the floor. Darkness swallowed the passage. And then, in the pitch black, a breath on her neck. Sarah bolted. She scrambled out of the crawlspace, kicking the hidden panel shut behind her. Her heart pounded as she backed away, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Silence. Then, scraping. Something was moving inside the walls. A whisper slithered through the cracks. "You shouldn't have seen me." Sarah ran. Sarah barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that grinning face staring from the crawlspace. She heard the whisper, felt the cold breath on her skin. She lay in bed, gripping the blankets, her ears straining in the silence. Then, a knock. Not at the door. Inside the walls. The scratching grows louder. She jolted upright, heart hammering. The sound moved along the wall, slow, deliberate. It traveled toward the closet. Then, scratching. Long, dragging scrapes, as if nails were raking against the wood. Her breath hitched. This wasn't just the house settling. This wasn't just the wind. Something was inside the walls. And it knew she was awake. The whispering returns. Sarah turned on the lamp, her hands trembling. The scratching stopped. For a moment, all was still. Then, whispers. "You found the door." Her stomach clenched. "We know you hear us." The voices slithered through the walls, overlapping, murmuring. Male. Female. Young. Old. Some sounded close. Too close. She pressed her hands over her ears, squeezing her eyes shut. "This isn't real. This isn't real." A giggle echoed behind the drywall. Right beside her head. "Something is watching." The closet door creaked open. Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't touched it. The whispers stopped. Silence pressed against her ears, thick and suffocating. Then, a slow exhale. A presence stood in the shadows. Watching. Waiting. She couldn't move. Couldn't scream. Then, from inside the closet. "Mommy?" Sarah gasped. It was her son's voice. But her son was asleep down the hall. She grabbed the lamp and hurled it toward the closet. Glass shattered. Darkness swallowed the room. A sharp whisper curled through the blackness. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The closet door slammed shut. Sarah bolted from the room, heart pounding. But as she fled down the hallway, she heard the whispers following her. Inside the walls. And this time, they were laughing. Sarah spent the night in the living room, every light in the house on. Sleep was impossible. The whispers hadn't stopped. They slithered through the walls, creeping from room to room. Laughing. Chanting. Calling her name. By morning, she couldn't take it anymore. She needed answers. A dark history. She drove straight to the town records office. The clerk gave her a puzzled look when she asked about her house. "You sure you want to know?" he asked. Sarah's stomach turned. "What happened there?" The man sighed, rubbing his temples. "That house has a history of people hearing things," he muttered. "Voices in the walls. Faces in the dark. It's been abandoned more than it's been lived in." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "Were there deaths?" she whispered. The clerk hesitated, then nodded. "Back in the 1950s. Family of 4. They disappeared. They never left." Sarah's blood ran cold. "Went missing," she pressed. "Not missing," the clerk said quietly. "They were inside the walls. When the police knocked the place down, they found them, sealed inside." Sarah staggered back. "No. They say the father did it," the clerk went on. "Sealed his wife and kids inside, then vanished. They found scratch marks in the wood. And teeth." Sarah felt sick. The clerk looked uncomfortable. "People who live there say the family still lingers," he said. "They whisper. Scratch. Try to get out. They know she knows." Sarah stumbled out of the office, her head spinning. She needed to leave. Now. But when she pulled into her driveway, dread filled her lungs. The house was waiting. The moment she stepped inside, the whispers exploded. "You found out. You know the truth. You can't leave us." The walls rattled. The house shook. A deep, rumbling groan rose from the floorboards. Then, a loud knock. From inside the walls. Sarah turned, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The closet door in the hallway creaked open. And standing in the dark was a shadowy figure. Watching. Waiting. Then it smiled.
Sarah's screams were cut off as the wall closed around her. The air turned thick and cold. She couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The darkness pressed in from all sides. And then, the whispers began again. "Shoo. You're one of us now." Inside the house. Sarah's hand scraped against wood and plaster. Her fingers touched something soft. Hair. A face. She gasped, but it wasn't her own. It was someone else. A child's voice whispered in the dark. "He put us here. The man in the house. He made us part of it." Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps. "You have to help us," the child begged. But the whispers behind her laughed. "The grinning man." A familiar voice slithered through the darkness. "There is no helping them." Sarah turned and saw him. The grinning figure loomed in the void, his body stitched from shadows and rot. "This house needs its voices," he rasped. His fingers stretched, curling toward her face. "And now, it has yours." The final scream. Sarah screamed. But the sound never left her lips. It was sucked into the walls, absorbed into the house. Her vision blurred. Her body faded. She was no longer flesh, she was a whisper. A shadow in the walls. A voice trapped forever. A new beginning. Days later, a for sale sign appeared outside the house. A young couple stood in the driveway, admiring their new home. "It's beautiful," the wife said. Her husband smiled. "Feels like it has a story to tell." The front door creaked open. And from deep inside the house, the whispers began again. "Welcome home." The end.
Sarah's screams were cut off as the wall closed around her. The air turned thick and cold. She couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. The darkness pressed in from all sides. And then, the whispers began again. Shoo. You're one of us now. Inside the house. Sarah's hands scraped against wood and plaster. Her fingers touched something soft. Hair. A face. She gasped, but it wasn't her own. It was someone else. A child's voice whispered in the dark. He put us here. The man in the house. He made us part of it. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps. You have to help us, the child begged. But the whispers behind her laughed. The grinning man. A familiar voice slithered through the darkness. There is no helping them. Sarah turned, and saw him. The grinning figure loomed in the void, his body stitched from shadows and rot. This house needs its voices, he rasped. His fingers stretched, curling toward her face. And now, it has yours. The final scream. Sarah screamed. But the sound never left her lips. It was sucked into the walls, absorbed into the house. Her vision blurred. Her body faded. She was no longer flesh, she was a whisper. A shadow in the walls. A voice trapped forever. A new beginning. Days later, a "for sale" sign appeared outside the house. A young couple stood in the driveway, admiring their new home. It's beautiful, the wife said. Her husband smiled. Feels like it has a story to tell. The front door creaked open. And from deep inside the house, the whispers began again. Welcome home. The end.